there such a thing as true and false? Is there such a thing as good and evil? And are those things clearly delineated? And I think they are if you have a faith in the God of the Bible. He is the moral lawgiver. And the moral lawgiver is the one that makes sure that we know the difference between right and wrong.
Welcome, everyone. Pastor J.C. Marquez here with my family, cousin, friend, intellectual thinker, Levi Montes.
Hello.
And we are excited to be here.
Super excited.
If you are watching this, we are officially putting out our first podcast. We had been talking about this for a long time. Finally, we're making it happen. So, yay.
Yeah.
Finally get to be here.
It goes from an idea and just kind of a, we'll do that one day.
Exactly.
Now one day arrived. So now we're here to actually do it.
Yeah, exactly. So we're excited. Thank you for clicking on this, watching and listening. We hope that it's a blessing to you. Me and Levi always get together. And when we do get together, we always end up having the best conversations. And so we thought, you know what? Let's record these.
Yeah. That was originally Pastor's idea. He kind of was like, you know what? These conversations are really good. We should put something to record. And it's like, well, make a podcast or something. And that was years ago. Yeah. Now we're finally doing it. I'm super excited.
So thank you for joining us. We don't have a name yet for our podcast. We're working on it still.
We'll get there. If you have any ideas,
put it in the comments. The JC and Levi podcast.
Yeah. For now,
seems like everybody names it after their name. So
and I don't realize why it's so much easier than trying to come up with one.
So, but this podcast is mostly going to be our little book club. We decided that we're going to be grabbing some books and reviewing it, reading them ourselves. We both love to read. We both like to study philosophy, theology, a little bit of everything. And so we're looking to have a good time.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I'm not a theologian and I'm not even a pastor or anything, but I think that's actually a good thing for this podcast. It's a good thing for us to talk to each other and to we're just regular Christians and we're just having conversations the way lots of other Christians have conversations. We just hope that our conversations can be something that maybe is hopefully insightful, hopefully edifying, but also hopefully can get you to have conversations with other people, and have these kinds of talks as well with them. And hopefully, I really hope that with this podcast, we can encourage you to actually read the book.
Yes.
Read along with us. The next, we're going to be talking about certain chapters or whatever. Read along with us. Yeah. It'd be fun. It would be cool.
Exactly. So we're really looking forward to it. But we want to introduce ourselves. For some of who may be watching this may not know who we are. Right. So we thought it'd be cool for us to introduce each other by saying some cool things about each other. Yeah. And so I'm going to let Levi go first.
Okay. So I know Pastor JC. Well, that's the first thing I can say about him. He's a pastor. And a great man of God. Somebody I always tell people all the time, the nicest person I've ever met in my life.
Thank you,
Pastor
bro.
JC.
Thank you.
So he's a pastor, and I know him because he is married to my cousin, cousin Nina, and that's you guys got married a little after I did. So you guys have been married for about 9 years. Yeah. So I've known you for a little over 9 years, and so it's been pretty awesome. And what I do know is for people who don't know, and I can share is I know that Pastor JC is very well read. I know that he does read a lot more than me. And I like to read, but reads a lot more than I do and really knows his theology pretty well and studies a lot. I've seen what he does to study. I've been to his house. I've seen his study materials. It's serious. And so that's the good thing. It's going to help, I think, a lot with this. I'm not that well read. I just kind of have I like to talk. I think that's more my thing.
He's being humble. Levi, what can I say about Levi? I think my favorite reason why I love having conversations with you is just your way of thinking, your intellect. You're a teacher by nature. You love to teach. But your way of approaching just thinking is unique. I know you're a musician as well. You're all right, bass player.
I do. I pass.
I'm kidding. He's an amazing bass player, guys. Please. He's really good. But one of the things I do respect about you and admire about you is just that you love to learn. You love to learn. So that's why this is going to be a lot of fun. And so let's get into this book. It's going to be an interesting book. We're going to be talking about C.S. Lewis, a lot of intellectual people's favorite author, right? A lot of Christians say that they became a Christian after they read one of C.S. Lewis's book.
Oh, yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about C.S. Lewis.
I know a little bit about him. I've read a few of his books. I was a big fan of the Chronicles of Narnia when I was a kid. I read them in middle school. I read them now to my son. And so I've always kind of liked his books. They can be a little bit tough to read sometimes, but it's good for vocabulary building for kids and stuff like that. But when you start reading some of his other works, and not just the Chronicles of Narnia, you start reading through For example, I read recently The Great Divorce, or I've read some of Mere Christianity. These are really theologically heavy books.
Yeah,
they're interesting, and he says things that are fascinating. And what's fascinating about it too is that he has an interesting perspective in that he wasn't a Christian for the whole first part of his life, and it wasn't until he was an adult that he finally came to a knowledge of Christ through some of his friends. He was a good friend of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was the author of The Lord of the Rings, and probably inspired the Chronicles of Narnia. But they became really good friends, and then he kind of just led him to Christ. So Tolkien was a Catholic, but Lewis became, I think, an Anglican or something
like that.
Yeah.
And one of his famous books became a movie, right? The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Lion, the Witch, and the
I
Wardrobe.
know I read that in 5th grade, and school is required reading.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those books that you will always remember.
I've read it with my kids in my school too. I'm a 6th grade teacher, so I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with them, and they liked it a lot.
Cool.
And it's kind of like, at this point, it used to be like 5th grade level reading, and I was like 8th grade level reading because the vocabulary levels have kind of dropped.
Pandemic.
But that didn't help. But the kids actually end up liking it, and then when you show them that it's actually it's like an allegory of Jesus, they're like, mind blown. Like, whoa. And that's what Lewis was really good at. Lewis was good at taking imagination and these fictional stories and applying them to these real life issues and actual Christianity. And that interesting mix of mythology and theology is something that actually opens up the mind a little bit more to accepting it. And we talked about this before the show. When you hear someone just prescribe something to you, it's very different from having someone tell you a story. When you have a story, it's almost like you drop your guard a little bit.
You do.
And you kind of pay more attention because we like stories. I tell my students all the time.
Yeah.
As human beings, we love stories. We like that plot diagram, We like the build up, we like the climax, we like the lesson learned. All of that stuff is really interesting to us as people. So how better to tell a story? Jesus knew this because Jesus would teach us through parables. Parables are stories, right? He could have just straight up given you the prescription. Yeah. He said, no, listen to the story. It's going to make a lot more sense to you if I tell it to you this way.
Yeah. That's interesting. Even preaching should be that way too. The best sermons have been like, people love to hear narrative preachings, right? Of Bible stories. It's easier to preach David and Goliath than the 1 Peter 3:7, right?
Yes,
something
big time, yeah.
Because we love stories. But why did this book is called Screwtape Letters, right? And you can help me expound a little bit more on this. But obviously this book is written also with C.S. Lewis's perspective of trying to get a Christian to understand the unseen world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. His original idea was to make the book about correspondence between angels. And then he realized that I don't really have much in common with angels. They're too angelic, right? Yeah. As human beings, we have this inborn sin, and we have this natural proclivity to evil. And so it's much easier to actually relate to the demonic, sadly enough. And so he says, well, then I'll write from that point of view. And he kind of made an interesting book of, demons, basically, in a way.
Yeah. And this book has 28 letters. So it's written from a perspective of two demons. It's the senior demon by the name of Screwtape. And then he's writing to his nephew by the name of Wormwood. I don't even know why he chose a nephew. I guess special relationship there. But we're going to get to see how C.S. Lewis perceives the Christian world and was thinking way ahead of his time.
Oh, yeah, big time. It's amazing. This first chapter we're going to talk about is like, it's
our
almost
time
like,
right now.
It's almost like prophetic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And some of the themes that we'll see, because we can, some of these chapters we can talk a lot about, some of them we can talk very little about. But just letter number 1, we're probably going to spend most of today on. But some of the things you'll see on here is just postmodern thinking, right? Philosophy, categorized. Yeah, exactly. And so they call us a certain period, the postmodern. They say we're after postmodernism now. I forgot what they called it. And then he also talks about the seen versus the unseen. Logic versus reason, which is something that we see really big, the definition of postmodernism. And so I want to start here by talking about letter number 1. He begins by saying, my dear Wormwood, he says, a note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friends. Right? So he immediately starts writing to him and telling him, he shows us that this demon is taking care of somebody, or he's in charge of somebody.
Patient, he calls him.
Yes, exactly. And so, but I want to talk about this word because he says you're making sure that he sees a good deal of materialist friend. What does that mean? What is materialism?
Yeah, materialism is this idea that everything that is can be observed, right? That it's this almost like this scientism idea, right? That there is no such thing as the non-physical. There is no such thing as the non-observable. And I say non-observable, and I don't want to stick too much to non-physical, because you might say, well, I don't know, some quarks or something, like subatomic particles. We can't see them, but but we know through science that you can actually observe them in some way. Maybe not visually, matter, but you can observe it mathematically, and you can observe it through some type of scientific method, right? But that's not all there is to life. And that was Lewis's point, right? There's way more to the world than the materialistic. And this book is an example of that, and that the book is about a demon writing letters to another demon. That's not materialist, right? Yeah. Demons, it's not a materialist thing. Yeah. And yet we know as Christians that those things are true. They don't have to be grounded in physical science.
Yeah, and that's the thinking of our day and age, right? Postmodernism in itself is this idea that there is no absolute truth, right? Which defines our world now.
Big time.
That's why it's so hard now to preach and to teach, right? And you have all these preachers on social media and YouTube everywhere. People are on a quest to find what is truth. And in a way, they're denying it and saying, my own personal truth is truth, your own personal truth. And that's really what defines postmodernism, right? The philosophy that there is no absolute truth.
Moral relativism.
Yeah, one of the defining tenets of it is moral relativism. Morality is defined based on relative to your location, your time, your day, and age, wherever you are. Yeah. And so what may be true for you is not going to be true for me.
Exactly what I was thinking.
Right? Yeah. And obviously ethics plays into that as well. But how C.S. Lewis was already talking about that.
Yeah.
I don't know, this is like 1980s. No,
this book's 70s. Probably a lot older than that. I'm actually not sure when he wrote it.
But I know it was after World War II, because that's one of the things that say that he was really affected by World War II. Yeah. And he talks a lot about how war affects humans. And so after World War II, he wrote this, but even after World War II, he was already thinking about our day and age, how we would deny the unseen world and focus just on the seen world.
Yeah.
And put
this rise of scientism, like I called it, this idea that science is almost like a god. It's people say, I've heard it put like, well, I don't believe in your religion, right? What do you believe in? Oh, I'm an atheist. Okay, so then what do you put faith in? What do you actually think you can base your ideas off of, or your worldview on? And they're like, well, the observable science. Okay, then science is your religion. Everybody has a religion. Everybody, in the words of Bob Dylan, everybody's going to serve somebody, right? Everybody's got to serve. Everybody has a God. Whether it's science or Jesus or it's themselves, we all serve somebody. So we got to stop lying to ourselves and actually understand that.
And I find it interesting that most philosophers are doctors, right? That we have nowadays. They ascribe to the teachings. Oh, it's just too difficult for us to explain. There's no words that can exactly describe my belief system, right? So they want to come up with new words to describe what we already know. You're denying God. You're denying morality, and you just want to choose your own.
Is there truth? Or is there not truth? Are there certain things that are they're objectively true, or is everything subjective? That's the question, right?
Exactly. And so that's what here the demon is writing to his nephew and telling him. He also goes on to say, the second sentence is, but are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds like as if you suppose that arguments was a way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. And I find it interesting he uses the word arguments there, because we live in a world where it's a war of words.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting also, I think, for us to make sure that the reader understands. Argument isn't necessarily angry. Argument isn't necessarily a fight. And our argument is not necessarily that you're upset with somebody, or even that you're just like, basically that. But if it's more of reasons.
Yes.
When you argue, what the classical definition of the word basically is, you're debating. You're having reasons
for yourself.
Yeah, you're coming. That's why people will say, come up with an argument. What does that mean? I'm arguing with somebody. That takes two people. No, it doesn't. An argument means a reason that you've come up for to explain something.
Logical thinking, sequential thinking, orderly thinking, which we're losing now thanks to ChatGPT.
Oh boy, that's a whole other.
But he goes on to describe arguments, right? And he goes on to say that might have been so good if he had lived in a different century, right? At the time when humans still knew pretty well that something that was proven was different from something that was not. He says. And if it was proved, they really believed it. Now, this is what postmodernism is. Everything is questioned. Even the most basic thing that for generations we believed has been true, now is no longer true just because we say. Yeah. Last time we were talking about that, right? I'll let you say what you were going to say before I lose your thought.
No, that's true. It used to be that we just knew things. Like it was common sense, even you could say, right? Like some stuff is just, you just know it. What I'm not against questioning things and kind of poking and trying to see the structure of something. Is this really stable? Is this actually a real thing? But once you find that it's stable, you kind of leave it alone. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know actually probably someone Lewis read a lot. G.K. Chesterton wrote talked about the fence, right? Yeah. If you come across a fence somewhere and you don't know what it's for, don't just tear it down right away. It might actually be there for a reason. It's actually keeping something at bay that's supposed to be kept at bay, maybe, right? Or it's supposed to delineate a boundary that's supposed to be there. Not all boundaries are bad. Not all traditional beliefs are evil. Like, where did we get this idea from? Is postmodern thinking, right? Yeah. Where we'll even get into, like, if we talk about the world today, when did it become like controversial or weird or not 100% certain that there's such a thing as a boy and there's such a thing as a girl? Mm-hmm. Like, when did that suddenly become like, well, but maybe not? It's common sense.
It depends, yeah.
Yeah, common sense.
Exactly. And I love, last time we were talking, we ended up talking about, you mentioned something interesting, the consent, right? You mentioned how the Constitution says, right?
Yeah.
What did you say?
Governed by the consent of the people, you know? Like, it's interesting. We have this idea nowadays where we think that as long as people consent to things, that therefore it must be good. Yeah. It must be true, or it must be right. But no, that's not true. You can consent to do evil. Exactly. But that's the world that we live in. We live in a world where it's like, well, whatever is good for you is good, it's for you. And if I agree with you, then then those things are good for both of us. Yeah. But maybe not for others, but for us. No. Is there such a thing as true and false? Is there such a thing as good and evil? And are those things clearly delineated? And I think they are if you have a faith in the God of the Bible. He is the moral lawgiver. And the moral lawgiver is the one that makes sure that we know the difference between right and wrong. And through the law, if we want to get really technical and theological about it. But yeah.
And this is why this book is so interesting, because he goes on to say, he says, your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside their head. And this is the world that we live in. Right? He wrote about this years ago. Yeah. And the danger of our young people now, even adults, right, listening to preachers online that are saying the most random, they sound good, but yet they're not biblical at all.
But you know what we end up doing with that? We do exactly kind of what Lewis says here. He's, right after that line, he says he doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false. Mm-hmm. He thinks of them as academic or practical, outworn. So what ends up happening is you start saying, well, I'm a person of the world. Like I'm kind of universal. Like well, there's certain things that Buddha says, and certain things that's in Confucianism, and there's certain things that are in Christianity that are good, and things in Judaism, and there's things even in Islam that I can take, and I can apply all these different things to my life, and they'll all just kind of build up who I am. Some things are just not compatible, and so you need to make a decision. Which one of these things is actually true? And again, here's the interesting part. I say make a decision, but the decision is not, is this thing? The decision is not, I'm going to choose which one is true.
Yes.
The decision is, have I successfully figured out which one is true? Because if one says one thing and the other says another, only one of them can be true.
Correct.
So if my truth says your truth is a lie, see what the subjective part kind of doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the hard part of our world that we live in now. Because as soon as you want to tell somebody truth, they like kind of close off, right? It doesn't matter that it's inspired word of God, right? Or even sometimes your own personal experience as well, right? Because you've had an experience with God and you know that He's real. And you're telling me, hey, this is what God did in my life. They're like, oh, that's for you only. That's not for me.
See that? And the problem with that is, and then I start thinking like, well, the Bible says that, but then I start trying to make caveats. Well, but that was just Paul saying that.
Yeah.
That's in the Bible. Hold on. What are we doing? Exactly. What are we doing? Or, the Bible says this, but, that doesn't really work in my situation. Paul must not have been talking about me.
Yeah.
No, I mean, come on. Is it true or is it not true?
Yes.
Looking for truth.
And this is why he goes on to say, right? Wormwood tells his nephew, he said, jargon, not an argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Yeah. It's a war of words now that we live in, right?
Yeah.
And he says, be careful. Use specific words, right? Now we talk about inclusivity. When we know the church is actually a place meant to be exclusive, only for people that believe in Jesus Christ. Right. But it's a message for everybody, right? And then he goes on to say, don't waste time here trying to make him think that materialism is true. Yeah. Make him think that it's strong, or stark, or courageous, that it's the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about.
Yes, he doesn't care about it. We don't care anymore if something's true or not. It's sad to say.
Yeah.
We don't. It's like, okay, well, you say that, but I don't think so. Well, how do we get to how do we get to the understanding that something is true? How do we find out if it's true? That's an interesting, I mean, maybe a little bit too deep for this right now, but that's something we got to think about. How do I know that the word is true? And that's where we get into apologetics and all that, but we can't just let it just be like, well, I don't know, maybe not. I don't know. We can't go through life. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think he gives us the answer in the very next line, because look what he says. He says, the trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. Because he says he can argue too. So this is the point of why Jesus chose preaching as the one tool to spreading this message.
Through the foolishness of preaching.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the reality that when we learn to truly look for truth, which you know is Jesus Christ, like truly, genuinely look for it. I'm not talking about looking for what you desire, what makes you happy, but you really want to know who God is, the maker of the universe, who gave you life, right? And you think about the wonders of the world. You think about how, I think it's Saturn that has the rings around it, right? And they said that as they got closer with the satellite and they started taking pictures, they saw that the rings are wrapped around.
Yeah, like braided.
They're braided, right? And I was like, man, just thinking about stuff like that makes you leave you in a wonder, the awe of God. Like, okay, so there is something greater. There is a higher power. Who is he? Right? And obviously, there's only one truth until you end up at Jesus Christ of Nazareth, right? That's why.
I think if you follow it, I think if you follow it enough, you take that thread and you kind of follow it long enough, you'll eventually get to Jesus. I think that's what a lot of people, especially even people like Lewis, I think they tried different things.
Yes.
And then they finally realize, like, this is always goes and leads back to the truth of the Bible. It comes back to Jesus. And that's just the way it goes. I remember meeting someone in an airplane on a flight, and she told me, like, she was a teacher, I think. This is before I ever became, I was like a teenager, I think. I think I just graduated from high school. And she was telling me, I've read like everything. I've read like all the different religions, and I've studied like all of them because I'm trying to find which one's true. And I gave her, I kind of evangelized to her there and told her this is why the truth of the gospel is the one true word of God. Right? Because people will come and they'll be Muslims or whatever and be like, well, but that same, we believe in Jesus. And why? And then you have to have your reasons.
Correct.
And so that's really important
too.
Yeah.
I guess that's what the scripture tells us, to be ready in season and out of season, right?
Yeah.
To
give a defense.
Yeah, give a defense of our faith. Exactly. And so that's the answer. The way we get there, the way we find truth is through arguments, really.
Through logic, through reasoning, to talking to each other. It's almost like the Socratic method, basically. You
pretty
just
much
sit there and you talk to each other and you just work through these things.
Sometimes even with your own self, right?
But isn't it so much harder to do that when we live in a world that doesn't encourage conversation like that?
True.
We live in a world that encourages quick bites, sound bites, tweets,
reels,
right? Quick little, just 5 seconds. You can't have a deep conversation when it's 5 seconds each. I mean, you see people that like beef with each other on Twitter, and it's like these tiny little messages are just quipping back and forth at each other. That's not a debate. That's not a conversation. That's not what's happening. We've lost out on this idea of debating and talking and just trying to think through things, because you think through things so much better when you say them.
Yeah.
It's one thing to think of it through your head, but when you have a back and forth with somebody, you're bouncing your ideas off and they're bouncing them off you, and you come up with stuff. And you start realizing, oh, that's why it's this way. Well, that's what he meant by that.
Yes.
Right?
And that's like they tell us as teachers, right? Because I was a 5th grade teacher for a little bit. The best way to learn is to teach it yourself.
Yeah.
And you get the kids to teach it to other kids.
I tell people all the time when if I give a message or whatever, I say, I'm talking to myself too right now. Like God is giving it to me also. I have to take it myself.
Yeah.
I can't just say it to you and say like, oh, I've attained. Like, no, I'm learning it also. I don't know if you said this line, but this kind of goes along with the rule. I don't know if you said it already. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason, right?
Yeah, that's what's going next. Yeah.
Okay, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result? By that act of talking to each other and giving your reasons, you're waking something up in the mind, a consciousness of the real. That's what he's talking about, the real. Yeah. Now you're opening up your borders of your mind to these concepts that you had never thought of before. I tell people sometimes they ask me kind of like, how was it, in college? My minor was in philosophy, and it was really hard not because the content's hard. It is hard, but it was really hard because a couple of things would happen. One, you sit there in the class and you're going through all these really high-minded kind of like
exercise
stuff.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I've kind of kept from it, because I don't remember a lot of it. It was a long time ago, and it was like these really hard books to read and stuff. You're going to remember it 13 years later. But what I did get from it was like it expanded my brain. It almost like was like working out. Like I don't remember exactly what I read all the time, but I know that my ability to think on a higher level increased because I was forced to think on a higher level for extended periods of time.
Yes.
And it's like that muscle grew. And if we don't have those kinds of conversations, if we don't study those kinds of things, we're not growing. Our brain is not expanding its ability to think. Now, the hard part with the philosophy was that a lot of it was trying to disprove God's existence. And so, of course, that put a lot of stress on me and my mind. And I'm young. I don't know my apologetics that well. Yeah. And that's why I tell people, you've got to know. I think the scariest thing we can do is send our high schoolers out into college or whatever, and they don't even know what they believe.
No reasoning skills.
It's a shaky, sandy foundation. They're not firmly built on something. Yes. And so they fall apart right away. It's not that the reasons for belief are bad. It's that they don't know them.
They don't know them. They don't even know how to explain it, how to word it. Yeah. And that's why it's important for us to be evangelize, is because you're learning how to voice what you believe, your convictions, right? Mm-hmm. You're learning how to explain to other people, like, this is why I believe what I believe. Yeah. And if you can't do that, do you really believe it?
Right. Yeah. And that's we talked about that the other day, right? Do we actually believe what we read in the Word? Do we actually believe what we even say? Right? Mm-hmm. I have faith in God. Has it ever been tested?
Yeah.
If you ever actually prove it, not to other people, prove it to yourself that you actually do believe it.
Exactly.
I trust in God. Really? When's the last time that you actually were tested in that? So as much as I wish my life was just a series of not being tested and just being like everything a blessing all the time, I go from glory to glory, brother. Right? No, it's not. Life has its challenges and its trials. And I think the people that sometimes you see, I'm like, man, that guy's always going through it all the time. But but that guy's really being refined. Yes. That person's being tested. And if they come out the other end, man, they're going to be something powerful. The problem is a lot of times they don't come out the other end. And they fall apart.
Yeah, which is what we're going to see here, right? But one of the things I wanted to say about this very same line, right? He says the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reasoning, is he understands that once he awakens reasoning, we have been teaching ourselves how to think and reason. So it leads us to an opportunity to see right through the lies of the devil and the truth of God's word. Because our life is built on these promises, these ideas or beliefs that we have, right? And so let's say I hold to a belief that God doesn't exist, right? But yet, as I'm going through life, I'm realizing God's sending me signs left and right. I eventually have to come to the realization that God is real and that the devil has been lying to me. Mm-hmm. That there is an enemy that has been trying to sow lies into my life to get me not to believe God.
You know what's funny about that? And it has to do with the book, because the book's about these demons trying to trip people up, is I think sometimes one of the greatest proofs of God's existence is the very thing that most people try to use to disprove God's existence, and that is evil, right? Mm-hmm. When you see evil, people say, well, how can God exist if God allows all these evil things to happen? I see it the other way around. God must exist if all these things are happening, because how can there be an evil without a good?
Exactly.
And you don't know what evil is unless you know a good. Just they kind of goes hand in hand. How do I know good without evil? How do I know evil without good? The contrast is what we see. It's not like there's this embodiment of evil, I guess. It's just more the contrast.
Correct.
This is not right. This is not good. This is not holy. This is not righteous. So therefore, it must be evil, right? So I can, when I see, it's people talk about, well, I see the hand of God moving in my life. That's awesome. It's powerful. And I've seen that in my life as well. But I've also seen the hand of the enemy working in my life. I've seen him trying to attack. Yes. I've seen literally almost, I mean, can't see him physically, but I'm almost to the point. Yeah. I almost feel like I do, because you start seeing stuff, you're like, hey, he's sneaky, man. Like, he's a liar. He's trying to put these thoughts in my head. Yeah. Or this thing happened right now in front of me, and I didn't react the way I should have, and I'm thinking like, why did that happen right now? Mm-hmm. And I start thinking, he's doing something. Yes. The way this person's trying to get me to respond in a negative way or whatever. I'm starting to see also not only the hand of God, I see also the hand of the enemy, and that just gives me further evidence. Yes. We're in a spiritual warfare.
Yes.
Gives me further evidence that there is a God. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And there also is an enemy. See, but a lot of times people don't want to believe in that. They don't want to believe in that enemy, because then that enemy leads to the belief in hell.
Yeah.
When you start having to think about hell, people get scared, and then they fall away. And I think Lewis talks about that.
I heard something interesting. He says, it was a preacher. I don't know who it was. It was an older preacher. He says, before the gospel can be good news, first it must be bad news.
You want the good news first or the bad news first?
Right. But it needs to be bad news first, right? Yeah. And so that's why you don't hear a lot of preachers now preaching about hell. Yeah. Nobody wants to hear about hell.
No one wants to hear bad news. We already live in a bad enough world, right?
Yeah.
You're telling me there's something worse than this?
Yeah. It really is. Exactly. And so here, continue. He says the last sentence in paragraph number 2, he says, your business is to fix his attention on the stream Teach him to call it real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real.
Powerful.
That's the postmodern thinking right there.
Yeah, big
Right?
time. This is where we talked about this before. It was like he's like almost prophetically like seeing to social media.
Yes.
We see it as real, that FOMO and stuff, like the fear of missing out, and all those things that come from social media. All of that, it's almost like he said it word for word, because he even uses the word stream.
Yes. Exactly. Like
live streaming. Like, we're doing that right now, but that's good. But he even uses the word stream. It's kind of like, man, it's almost on the nose, right? This idea that what is real is what I see my friends doing on social media and posting and all that. Is that really real?
Yeah.
Or are they really miserable and they're just kind of putting a facade on? I don't know. Right? When's the last time I called them and actually talked to them?
Correct.
You know, like,
we don't know more.
Birthdays.
Nobody calls no more for birthdays or
it's quick text.
Like, you see it on social media. It's like, oh, they had a baby. You didn't know?
Like,
well, I haven't been on social media. Well, yeah, it's on social media. They're not telling nobody.
Wow face.
Exactly.
That's as deep as our discourse gets, unfortunately. And I'm part of it, right? We gotta call it out. But we talked about this the other day too. It's like these words that we don't even realize. Like social media, they call it your feed. I mean, every time I think about the feed, it always bothers me because it makes me think I'm like cattle. And they're just like giving me feed. And this is your feed. Take your feed. Take your feed, cow. Yeah. Right? Here's your feed. Feed, eat it. Don't get up and do anything else. Don't actually be productive. Don't actually go talk to anyone. Don't just be on your feed and eat it. Eat what we give you. You're going to eat what we give. And there's a whole algorithm built around that. I mean, you're telling me this is not purposeful? You're telling me this is not like a plan?
You made me think about the prodigal son, because it was that moment of realization when he was with the pigs.
Eating the feed.
Right? When he realized, man, I desire a pig's meal, but in my father's house, you know, the slaves at my father's house ate way better than I am here with the pigs. So
the father's house is the real.
Yeah.
And then the evil out there in the world was the surface. That was the carnal side. There was nothing actually substance there. There was no meat there. There wasn't anything worth, give me something I'm worth holding on to. And there was nothing worth holding on to out there. That's why you let it go.
And so here the demon eventually ends up saying, right, remember, he's not like you, a pure spirit, never having been a human. You don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressures of the ordinary. So he's talking about how when we get to that moment of realization, we're going to realize truth. We're going to realize our need of God. He says he distracts us for reminding us about the ordinary things of life.
He gives that example, right? In the book, he gives an example of a man. Screwtape says, well, I had a patient, right? One of the people he's trying to tempt, who was at the museum and he's starting to study and he started getting kind of dangerously close to discovering the truth, the real world, the gospel maybe even, right? And he's starting to get, his brain is starting to build up in these ideas. And then how does he stop him?
He says, I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control and that suggested it was time for some lunch.
Simple. Isn't that crazy? Like something so important is your salvation and we can get like diverted like I'm hungry. You know what? Yeah. Let me think about that instead. Put this aside for a minute. I've seen this with people that you can evangelize to them and you can tell them about God and you're like, man, I'm finally doing it. I'm talking to someone about Jesus. Like I'm evangelizing to someone, and it feels good. Like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the person will just be like, "Kind of hot. You hot?"
Yeah, exactly. Right. Something random.
It's starting to rain out there.
Yeah.
And you're like,
"Are you hungry? Let's go grab some lunch."
You're like, "Man, we're so close." Like your eternity is like hinging on this, and we're like distracted by something so mundane. But that's when you're not hooked up to the real. It's almost like people talk about the Matrix, right? The movie, right? Yeah. Are you hooked up into the real, or are you just hooked up into this simulation? Are you hooked up into what the enemy wants you to be living, which is just this mundane life, every day doing the same cycle. Nothing changes. Your life stays bad. You're just going through the motions, and then you die. That's your life. Your life. The worst thing someone could put on my tombstone is he lived. He lived and he died. That was it. I did nothing. I didn't do anything with my time. I didn't impact anybody. I didn't make a difference. I think about my uncle, right? Your father-in-law who passed away. I want a funeral like his. Yeah. When you went to that funeral, it was packed. We had to have it in the parking lot. Yeah. It was packed. Why? Because of how many people he impacted. You could go around and ask all those people, they'd have something positive to say about him. They'd say something that he did for them in their lives. Yeah. Because that's making a difference. He didn't live on his phone doom scrolling. No. He went out there and did something. And I worry because it is tempting to sit there and just doom scroll all morning, or before you go to bed, and you're just like, well, I don't even know I stop myself sometimes and say, what am I looking at? What am I even doing? Is this really helpful? Am I getting anything done? Get up, go do something. Like, what the heck? That's scary.
It really is. Yeah, and it goes back to this idea. One of the notes that I wrote here is a famous line from Milton. John Milton. He portrays a character, right? And he's talking about the rebellion against God, which is ultimately what we're all after. Yeah, and he this one line that caught my attention from his book. He says, "It's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven."
Yeah,
right. I was like, man, that way. Yeah, I was like, man, I could preach a whole sermon on that alone, right?
Powerful, yeah.
How nowadays we want to just live for our own pleasures, right? We're reigning in our own lives. Here he's talking about reigning in hell, because obviously the devil rebelled against God because he wanted to reign. He wanted to be like God. It doesn't matter that he was going to be apart from God. It didn't matter he was going to be in hell. And a lot of Christians, or even people in this world, live their lives that way, right? Why? Because they don't want to submit to God. Why? They don't want to even serve.
Too hard to submit to God. Because if I submit to God, then I have to give up the things that I want, that I like.
Time, treasure, which is your money, right? My talents, which is the abilities that God has given you.
And also giving up things that aren't good for me, that I think that are good for me, right?
We have to die to our flesh, to the desires of our flesh.
Who wants to do that?
Sleeping in on Sundays.
Yeah. Who wants to do that? Who wants to
serve VBS? Nobody wants to serve VBS.
No. You want to do what you want to do. It's the inherently selfish nature of the human being.
Correct.
It's just the way we are, unfortunately. And God calls us to be more than that, right? To be there's the old Switchfoot song, you say there's a new way to be human. It's a new way to be human, a better way, right? That's why we become a new creation in Christ when we're born again.
Yes.
Creature.
Renewing our minds.
Renew your mind, exactly. To break from the pattern of the world. It's a pattern. It's a cycle, and you have to break that. It's not easy.
And the only way to break that is to find a better idea, which is the ideas of God. And a lot of ideas of God at first don't make sense to you until you submit your will to God's, and you realize, oh, now I understand why God is asking me to die to myself, right? So that I can find my life.
And and interestingly enough, in the next few chapters, Lewis does talk a little bit about that, this idea of a relation to the church, and how the church can be unfortunately sometimes even a stumbling block. But that's the next chapter. So but you're talking about something that comes about through argument, through reason, through logic.
Exactly. Do you want to mention some of these other points that you had here? We already talked about culture of the consented, right? It is not the claim that different people in different places, in different societies disagree about what's right or wrong.
Yeah, I mean...
so we can take claims about... and here he's talking about the philosophical thinking of moral relativism. I know we already talked about this, but I had it here in the notes. Relativism is a claim that every society is correct.
So if I let's say we're talking to someone from an island in the middle of nowhere, and they eat each other, cannibals, right? In their society, that's normal. Is it then good? Right? If you don't have an objective moral good, then you would say yes. And I've heard people do that. Like I've seen online, people have these debates, and they'll have like college students or whatever talking to them. They'll ask them, like, if that was the case, would you think it? And they'll straight up say, yeah, it was good. So you're telling me that in Nazi Germany, everyone agreed, burn, kill, gas the Jews.
Yep. That was the right thing.
So therefore it's good?
Yeah.
It's right? No, it doesn't work that way. There's a good and there's an evil. Yeah. And if you can't delineate those things, we got major problems. Our society falls apart. And that's my fear for our society today. That's my fear for our country today. That we're losing the subjective moral good, the subjective moral right and wrong. And so because anything can be good, anything can be right, well then we'll end up doing anything. And when you end up doing anything, you fall into the depravity and the
which is why they call a lot of the other countries that say they want death to the West. Because it's really us, the West, right? The United States and Europe that are bringing these ideas.
But you know what's really crazy about that? A lot of the people that will say this death to the West stuff are more religious than even we are in the West. Isn't that interesting? They have a lot of them are Muslim. So they have these beliefs, the Sharia law and stuff like that, that it's even more strict. Yeah. And what's mind-boggling to me is you'll have these college students that are extremely progressive and liberal who are siding with that. And you say, do you know what you're siding with? These are people that are way more strict on these things than any Christian you've ever met in the United States. And yet you're siding, but it's just confusion.
It really is.
A lot of confusion. Yeah. People don't know what they're talking about.
One of the things that I talked about, one of the tenets of relativism is tolerance.
Yeah.
Right? How they want to tolerate everybody's relative morality, right? It's right for them.
Yeah.
Right?
So leave them alone.
Yeah, leave them alone.
and they'll say this, so the example, if you ever see anything, right, on social media, for example, and they post something and it doesn't align with God's word, it's, homosexuality or something like that, and you'll have Christians in the comments saying things about it like, hey, that's
support
not,
it, yay.
yeah. Well, they'll either support it or you'll also have people that don't.
Mm-hmm.
And you always see on the comments on the people who don't support it, someone will go on there and be like, well, God teaches us to love everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So what are they doing wrong? Yeah. You're acting like you're a high and mighty Christian, like you've never done anything wrong, you're just supposed to accept everyone. No, the Bible doesn't teach us to accept everyone. The Bible, and it's crazy enough, if there's anything, the Bible is the only thing that if we want to take it back far enough, the Bible is what teaches us to have a form of tolerance. Mm-hmm. I'm supposed to love my neighbor. I'm not going to go out and kill you because you don't believe like I do. No, right. The Bible doesn't teach that. No. Right? You love everybody. But loving someone does not equate accepting their sin. Mm-hmm. That's the part that is just, they don't get it. So many people don't get it because they think, how can I, and I've heard this before, right? I'll say, well, love the sinner, we hate the sin. And they'll say, how can you love someone if you hate who they are? And that's the problem. Yeah. In our modern culture, we equate what you do with who you are. Yeah. And that's not necessarily, my sexual identity, for example, is who I am. Correct. No, it's not necessary.
And it can't change.
No, you are a soul that has a body. Your body has certain proclivities and desires and whatnot. That doesn't mean that's your soul. Your soul needs to have dominion over the body. Yeah. You make a decision about what you want to do. I was listening to that. I need to share it with you. An interview with a couple. The guy was gay and the girl was trans, right? Trying to be a boy, but was actually a woman. They got married. They became Christians. Oh, wow. And they prayed that God would take that desire away from them. And he did. So you're telling me the soul knows and can find the good and the right and the true. You didn't have to make the body subject itself to that. You have to subject your body. So, this idea of tolerance is again, at a base level, biblical in that we are supposed to love others, but never says that God hates sin. Yes. So I got to hate sin. God loves people.
Yes.
I've got to love people.
Correct.
It's not loving for me to go to you and tell you that you're doing something right when you're not. It's not loving of me to support something that's going to lead you to hell.
Correct.
Oh, I love you so much. You're there, drugged out all the time and everything. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna, you need more help by yourself. You need some money for that. Yeah, how's that helping the person? I'm hurting them. Oh, but I'm loving them because I'm agreeing with them. Agreeing with someone is not necessarily love.
I know. And so, I'll bring this up for whoever's watching. Maybe they've asked this question before. What do you do when your friend is gay and they invite you to their wedding? Do you go or do you not go to the wedding? And so, but my response would be, okay, so do you want to support the actions? What are your convictions? Do you believe it's right or do you believe it's wrong? Besides the point that you may be friends with them, because obviously the Bible calls us to love our neighbor, right? But how can we support that kind of lifestyle? Go and be a witness to seeing them get married, right? And so my advice would be kindly, as best as you can, not go.
Because the wedding is a symbol of the act. And it's against, biblical truth. So you can love them and hang out with them and stuff in other places, but that specific situation
and you can't control. Hopefully, as much as they want us to be tolerant of their beliefs, hopefully they can be tolerant of the fact that what we believe as well. Not get offended. Just because I don't go to your wedding doesn't mean I don't love you, right? Or care about you. Right. Genuinely care about you. That doesn't align with my beliefs, my convictions, and what I believe that God teaches us.
The danger we fall into with the relativism is that people will be like, well, then those are your beliefs, and so therefore, if mine are different, then that invalidates yours. It is not. There is such a thing as a true belief. And that's what we're trying to find. That's what we're trying to get to through the word and people say, well, what is, you'll give people Bible verses or something. And they'll be like, well, why should I believe the Bible? What makes that true? Okay, that gets all into apologetics and that gets into studying the scripture or studying where it comes from and using logic. And again, even moral objectivism is something that can lead us back to understanding God and seeing the existence of God. The cosmological arguments and all these different arguments teleological arguments, all these different arguments you can get to. That's a whole other animal. But once we know that the scripture is true, you gotta listen to it.
Correct.
Because if it's true, then it's the most important truth in the world. Yeah. If it's not true, then it's literally the least important thing. It's literally a fiction. You're basing your life off of Harry Potter or something. It's not even real. It's just, so either it's 100% true, or it's not true at all. If what the word is telling us is true, then my whole life
has to take a turn. And a lot of people, they'll say, well, I believe in the Bible. I think that is true. Yeah, Jesus existed. And they go back and go do whatever they're doing. And they just live their life however they want. They don't live it based on what's it. If you really believe it's true, then you got to follow it, because there's only two ways to go. Mm-hmm. So do you really believe it's true?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, Lev, this has been awesome, man. I've had a lot of fun doing this. So hopefully next week we can get together and do letter number 2.
Yeah.
Hope that you guys that have been watching this have enjoyed this. Thank you so much for being here for this. Listen to this whole thing. I know we enjoy this conversation.
Yeah, it's fun.
It's fun for us.
It's like how we talk like on a regular Saturday or something.
Yeah. Put your comments in the chat. Let us know what you think about what we're talking about. Even if you disagree with us, or if you agree with us, let us know. We'd love to hear what you have to say. So, thanks for your time. I'm looking forward to doing this. Like and subscribe and share. Exactly. That's how we get more people to listen to this. So thank you. We'll see you again soon. And God bless. God bless.